Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, friends, both old and new, for joining us today. It's so nice to see so many familiar faces here. I mean, there are friends of the gallery we see often, but I feel like I'm seeing people that I don't see that often and from other places, and it's really exciting. It's keeping my heart warm, and I know it's keeping the room warm too. My name is Crystal Morey, and I'm the Director of Programs here at the Mackenzie Art Gallery. I'm honored to be welcoming our guests, Gabrielle Moser, Nura Ali, and our old friend Tak Pham to Regina today. And, for those of you who are maybe coming through Regina for the first time or not that familiar with this place, it's historically known as, I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, but I'll try, Oskana Ka'asasteki, which is Plains Cree for pile of bones. And we're situated on the traditional territory of the Nihio, the Saulteaux, Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota people. And it's also the homeland of the Métis Nation. And like each of you joining us in this room, I enter a promise, both literally and figuratively. So each time we enter this building, we walk under a work by Dwayne Linklater. You've probably seen it, more so at nighttime. It really sings at nighttime. It's that illuminated text that lines the top of the building. And those words are, "As long as the sun shines, the river flows, and the grass grows." And it affirms a commitment to reciprocity between Indigenous and settler people on this land. And at the Mackenzie, that is a bond that we seek to honor in the way that we work here on this land, with one another, and across time. On behalf of the team here at the Mackenzie, we acknowledge our relative youth as a cultural organization when compared with the deep history of this land. Together, we acknowledge and offer our utmost respect to the elders and ancestors, past, present, and future, who have called Treaty 4 their homeland. As guests on this land, we are grateful for the opportunity to gather here, to have our feet on this ground, and to exchange ideas with the land, the water, and the community as our witness. As newcomers, and here I'm speaking specifically for myself, we have a role in learning about and caring for this land so that we can do our work. I can do my work sustainably, honorably, and with collective purpose. We recognize that with each of our programs, there is an opportunity to learn along with our community and to encourage change. Some of you may have heard that 2023 is an important anniversary for the Mackenzie. It's our 70th, though we may not look a year over 40, maybe. And with anniversaries like this one, these kind of pretty substantive anniversaries, there comes an opportunity to reflect on our shared past and the role that the archive plays in shaping our sense of what is worth saving for future generations and whose subjectivities should be honored in the public record. We're thrilled to premiere new work by Winnipeg-based artist Luther Konadu, which hopefully you've all had a chance to see upstairs. And Luther's show joins other lens-based projects that were launched earlier this year. So exhibitions by Deanna Bowen, Paul Cisaquasis, and Annie MacDonald, each of whom are similarly troubling a singular and often distantly authoritative institutional voice within the archive. Konadu's exhibition, titled No Further, will be on view in our Sim Gallery until January 14th. So please head up there after the talk again and then come back again in the next month. We'd love to see you more often. And this exhibition is curated by Tak Pham, who used to be the Mackenzie's own associate curator. It's the first exhibition in our next series, which is a series of projects that focus on early career prairie-based artists, all realized with the support from RBC Emerging Artist Program. The Mackenzie is also grateful for ongoing support that it receives from the South Saskatchewan Community Foundation, the Canada Council for the Arts, Sask Lotteries, City of Regina, and University of Regina, and Sask Arts. Today, we're joined by three dynamic thinkers who, through their own critical and curatorial practices, offer new ways of positioning photography, representation, and refusal within the same rich discourse that is of interest to Luther Konadu. Today's conversation will be moderated by art historian, critic, and independent curator Gabrielle Moser. I'll introduce Gabby, and then she's going to introduce our other guests. Gabrielle Moser is the author of Projecting Citizenship, Photography and Belonging in the British Empire, published by Penn State University Press in 2019. And her writing appears in venues including Art Forum, Journal of Visual Culture, Photography and Culture, Prefix Photo, and Third Text. Moser has held fellowships at the Paul Mellon Center for the Study of British Art, the Image Center, the University of British Columbia, the British Library, and was a Fulbright Scholar at Brown University. She is currently completing a book manuscript on photography, race, and citizenship in Canada for McGill Queen's University Press. Moser is a founding member of Amelia Amalia, and she is Associate Professor of Aesthetics and Art Education in the Faculty of Education at York University in Toronto. And with that, I'll hand it off to Gabby to introduce Tak and Nura. Thank you, Gabby.
Thank you. Thank you, Crystal. It's so nice to be here. Thank you all for coming. I want to thank Tak for bringing us all together, and to Nicole Nugent, Crystal Mowry, and John Hampton so graciously for hosting us. I'm going to say a little bit about the format of the talk before I introduce these two folks. I am billed as the moderator, but we're really going to have a conversation amongst the three of us about Konadu's practice and the exhibition upstairs. And we've each chosen some images from the documentation from the exhibition that will rotate up behind us. Each image will show up for about 3 minutes before it goes on to the next. But we're not going to have a structured conversation. We'll each sort of think through our responses to the images, and they may or may not line up with what you see on the screen behind us, but I think that's fitting for Konadu's practice as a kind of ongoing research and studio-based practice. And we'll take up some of the sort of working methods that he uses in the studio, his theoretical references, his commitment to community, and some of our responses as viewers. And then we have set aside some time for discussion with the audience in the last 15 minutes or so. And the whole talk will take about an hour is the plan. So I'm going to introduce my colleagues. Tak Pham is a Vietnamese contemporary art curator and writer. He's currently curator of the Illingworth Kerr Gallery at the Alberta University of the Arts in Calgary, Treaty 7 territory, and was formerly associate curator at the Mackenzie Art Gallery here in Regina, Treaty 4 territory. Pham holds an MFA in criticism and curatorial practice from OCAD University, where we first met working together, and a BA honors from Carleton University. He's curated exhibitions and organized projects for the Mackenzie Art Gallery, Contemporary Calgary, Confederation Centre Art Gallery, Varley Art Gallery, the Art Gallery of Ontario, and Nuit Blanche Toronto, among others. His writing and reviews have appeared in Canadian Art, C Magazine, Espace, S Arts and Opinions, Galleries West, Studio Magazine, Art Asia Pacific, and Hyperallergic. And this past year, Pham was awarded the Natition Foundation Foco Island Arts Young Curator Residency. Nura Ali is a visual artist, writer, and curator living and working in Calgary. She received a BFA in Visual Arts from Emily Carr, University of Art and Design, a BA in English Literature, Art History, and Italian from the University of Leicester, and a BA in History from Goldsmiths. Her wide-ranging practice investigates the linguistic scaffolding that upholds the assumptions we bring to the acts of reading and writing. Alongside her visual arts practice, Nura is also a prolific writer, a lifelong learner, and has participated in various national and international residencies. Her work has been shown nationally and received numerous awards and grants, most recently from the Calgary Arts Development, the Roja Foundation, and the Canada Council for the Arts. She is also a founding member of the Vancouver Artists' Labor Union, a unionized workers' cooperative whose mission it is to transform labor practices in the arts sector and create fair, equitable, and sustainable working conditions for artists and cultural workers. Thank you for being here. So I think we're going to start with some slides from the exhibition upstairs. And I don't know who wants to speak first. Tak, do you want to maybe start by walking us through some of the images you chose in relation to the exhibition?
For sure. My images actually don't come a bit later in the slide, but for folks who have had the opportunity to view or walk through the exhibition upstairs, you will notice that there is this kind of like combination of images and some other formal elements, such as in this example that we can see kind of like these vertical strip of what looked like a behind the scenes like documentary type of photography, paired with these kind of like very formal blocks of colors, and and it's very like fitting in the way to like represent or to start off as the first image that represent the exhibition. Got no further. It's kind of like signal this idea of there's something else going on behind those screen, right? Those kind of like in this case like browned out, right? But like, you can see like glimpse of what's going on behind it, but then you don't fully see the whole picture. And then, in an effort of knowing more, of you like satisfy your own curiosity, you have to do the work of, walking through and then pay attention to these texts that are pretty much kind of like very small, right? Like, I try my best to like crop and like zoom up this kind of like image, but you can barely make up, the letters. So the only way for you to access it is to go upstairs and stand very closely and read these texts. Some are very straightforward, while others are very quite ambiguous. But it's kind of like, I think like as while I was working with Konadu in putting this show together, that is the common kind of like desire, that the artist and myself are committed to, kind of like trying to find this balance in communicating the vision, and the direction of the show, of the work, but at the same time, try to maintain this like elusive access that often when working with a curator or when showing, exhibiting your work, you as an artist have to open up and to kind of like put yourself out there under the spotlight, out there and expose all of your thinking. So the process of putting the show together was pretty much about trying to navigate and kind of like trying to find the sweet spot of compromises where you show just enough but not too much. But there's also that dynamic that you like to engage with the viewer, with the visitors, that they can still understand the exhibition. Maybe not at the first work that they see, but by the time they leave the show, they will have an understanding of what the show is about. Yeah, sorry, that's a very long description of what the first image was.
No, it was great because it was something I was thinking about that you touched on already. Tak, is sort of the tension between the center and the periphery that happens in so many of the images, where a picture is sort of cut off at the halfway point and then another slice of it will appear a few prints later, interrupted by these fields of just color. Or as you were saying, where you can sort of see on some of the table surfaces part of a text, but not the whole thing. It's covered by another print or another text or a book that interrupts your gaze as a viewer. And I think I chose one of this text in particular because it talks about transparency, one of the values we ascribe to photographs especially, right? That they communicate somehow a direct and immediate truth to us, which is also brought up in the title of this ongoing series, right? Which is Figure as Index. It's related to that ongoing series.
Yes. So this show is a development or like the newest iteration of that ongoing series. Yeah, Figure at Index.
Yeah. So even in that title of that series, the index is often associated also with the photograph, right, as a sign that points really directly to the thing that made it. The subject that stood in front of the camera produces the image in the sort of semiotic thinking about the index. But then that's interrupted constantly in Konadu's own practice and put under a lot of tension in the way that he works. And we were thinking too, I think, about the role of community. Did you want to maybe say a little bit, Nura, about? Yeah, well, whatever you want to say.
Well, I was actually going to talk about Kanadu by talking about somebody else.
Go for it.
So I was going to talk about Kanadu by talking about Saidiya Hartman. And that's for two reasons. It's firstly, in the ways that Saidiya Hartman thinks about her practice as a combination of theory and narrative, which I think is really pertinent to Kanadu's work. And also the way that she sort of uses a framework that she calls a labor of regard, in the way that this sort of slow, intimate looking as a way to approach the Black body in the archive and quotidian Black life. And I think that that's also really true for Kanadu's work in terms of how he thinks about and directs that looking, or that act of looking. And so I'm going to read one quote from Saidiya Hartman. It says, every generation confronts the task of choosing its past. Inheritances are chosen as much as they are passed on. The past depends less on what happened then than on the desires and discontents of the present. Strivings and failures shape the stories we tell. What we recall has as much to do with the terrible things we hope to avoid as with the good life for which we yearn. But when does one decide to stop looking to the past and instead conceive of a new order? When is it time to dream of another country, or to embrace other strangers as allies, or to make an opening, an overture where there is none? When it's clear that the old life is over, a new one has begun, and there is, when is it clear that the old life is over, a new one has begun, and there is no looking back? From the holding cell, was it possible to see beyond the end of the world and to imagine living and breathing again? And so for me, the way in which Konadu uses this labor of looking is part of that choosing of one's own past. And so I'm very sleepy today, so I'm just going to read my thoughts, if that's okay. So with Konadu, it's not only this sort of like deep looking that he does, but it's the ways in which he's able to combine and shift between different types of looking. So where you have, self-portraiture, and you have portraits of his family and his friends interspliced between National Geographics and the kind of very specific versions of looking that was done to the Black body in the National Geographic, and contemporary Black portraitists like LaToya Ruby Frazier, or current Black cultural thinkers and theorists like Tina Campt, all sort of like approaching this way of looking at the Black body from like a kaleidoscopic kind of viewing. And for Konadu, the way that he sort of amalgamates and creates these assemblages from these looks becomes this kind of like critical framework to investigate the gaze, and in particular, the nature of creating meaning out of the visual information that we're seeing. So it is a way to be able to, as a viewer, understand how the act of looking is not a neutral thing, and that it is something that is conditioned, shaped, and directed by the person who is creating the thing for us to look at. And so if we think of photographs and the way that him in like various of the photographs is positioned with the camera in hand, it shows this way of understanding the photograph not as a neutral, objective, detached representation of an objective reality, but as constructs that are indivisible from the positionality and the worldview of its creators. So even when photographs are pretending to have this detached neutrality, they're still engaged in that active narrative world building. And so photographs, like all other man-made constructs, come pre-laden with their own set of ethical packages. And for me, when I think about Konadu's assemblages, it's the way that he takes these various gazes or various narrative frameworks that these gazes create, and uses the way that the remix is used in music to take pre-existing constructs and new ones, and then splice them together in these new configurations and these new, constructions that then unfixes any kind of notion of overly deterministic or static visual blackness. So for me, the reason why I would always tie him back to Saidiya Hartman is the ways in which he's able to build a framework that is collaborative, that the images are working together in their meaning construction, and that they are like multi-directional and relational, and that all of these relationally made meanings come out of these adjacencies and out of the ways that these disparate elements can shift or add to the meaning of their neighbors. And this sort of like unfixing of deterministic categories of blackness traces, for me, its lineage back to fugitivity and Glissant's theory of opacity. So, when you talk about that idea of transparency, the opposite of it is opacity. And opacity, and by extension, illegibility, has a long history of being used by Black communities as a survival tactic against the ways that surveillance has been used to regulate police and more effectively exploit Black life and labor. And so the way that he sort of like shifts in and out of transparency and opacity within the works, with the, not only like with what you can and can't see, with these things that are parts that are folded over, or the parts that have almost look like they're redacted with the solid color fields, or things that are overlaying or partially covering other ones. It's a way to kind of think about sidestepping the idea that other people's subjectivities is only comprehensible if it contains some sort of recognizable familiarity or sameness with our own. So it's important to note that positioning comprehensibility with sameness reflects a positionality of power and a supposed ideological authority to judge and sort the subjectivity of others as either normal or strange or understandable or incomprehensible. And for me, when I think about opacity, I sort of like try to understand what are the benefits of that discomfort, because it can feel uncomfortable to be in that place of unsureness or uncertainty. But even though it is uncomfortable, there's still something challenging and exciting about being in that place of not knowing, because it's that feeling of disorientation that challenges us to rethink the ways that we think about looking at things. And when we don't really know what we're looking at, we're shifted into a more active kind of looking, that you then become like an investigator and a detective, and you're sort of like sorting the clues and trying to yourself understand the subconscious and the invisible ways that we're doing that process anyway, and the things that then might be conditioning the ways in which we're doing that. And so this, placing the audience into a position of unsure footing can be a way to build more complex ways to interact with each other, and ways that are not in spite of our differences, but with and through them. So those are my thoughts.
Wow, what a beautiful review of the show. Should we get a...
I mean, I love that you brought the Edouard Glissant reference in, who's a Martinican poet, maybe folks are well aware of this already, who talks a lot about the mirror as an example of this, right? That the Enlightenment obsession with the mirror being this sort of clear way of seeing the world, but then he points out that underneath the glass on top of the mirror is opaque surface covered in minerals, which has always, to me, like begged for a photographic parallel, because photographic prints are very similar, right? We imagine they have this like transparent, clear mode of communication, but then there is a literally opaque surface that they rest upon that's covered also in minerals. And in work like Konadu's, and I see references, some of which you've already named, Nora, but like Tina Camp's work is obviously very important. But I also think about Deanna Lawson's photographs of her community and friends as being an important reference. Leslie Hewitt's like very conceptual combinations, usually of like family photographs and very important books to her and to Black Atlantic theory, and sculptural objects, which we see lots of actually in this show, more than I've seen before in Konadu's works, that they're all like toying with this idea of legibility and illegibility, of direct representation, and to make something obscure or kind of hard to read. And I really like your idea of like the viewer being a detective who has to go through the show and make sense of all of these clues. And can you talk maybe a little bit, Tak, about the process of putting the exhibition together in that way? Is that something that you and the artist talked about?
I think, yeah. We talked about like conceptually about what the show would look like. So I think there was a lot of conversation about all of the the sculptural elements in the show, but I think the curatorial process in putting the show together is also kind of like a example of an exercise of trust. The trust between the curator and the artist, because it is a very much like a very like responsive exhibition where some ideas that you discussed at the very beginning of when you were planning the show a year before to when a day before the show opens, it had changed like drastically. So we were able to discuss kind of like putting kind of like the framework, kind of like the apparatus, through which the viewer will, access the exhibition, to experience the exhibition and to view certain components. But the content of it was pretty much driven by what the artists were responding when he was laying out the material on the table. And that process was very like, just like I say, very like organic and very like responsive, and it's also kind of like evolving with the artist's friendship, not only with the content and the subjects and the research, and all the literature on the table, but also with these subjects, with the people, who are part of his community, that he chose to capture and to represent it here, like in this, like in the exhibition space. One thing that I think would be very interesting to know is that it represents a 10-year of friendship. So you might see photos of some people kind of like from 10 years ago, and kind of like, and then you turn the corner and you see a photo of them which a few months ago when he took as the last few of new photo for the exhibitions. So in a way, it's kind of like mirroring kind of like the process of researching with the process of community, how it's evolved, how it developed, how some people come and leave, and new people arrive and take their place, and for a while. Yeah, so it's very fluid in that way. But I think like all of those elements relate back to my own curatorial process and experience through this project is about trust, right? Because in order to build a community, you would need trust among people in order to kind of like compose something so organically like that. You also need to have trust, not only of me in the artist, but also of the artist in their ability to respond to the environment and what was kind of like resonating with them at the time. Yeah.
Yeah. Did you want to say something?
I always have lots of things to say to things that Tak says, but I was thinking about this idea of the iterativeness of his work, or the ongoing iterativeness of his work, and having certain subjects show up again over a number of years. And it was making me think about this because there's some ways that we can think about art as an object or an image becoming successful when it attains a certain kind of understandability for other people, and that its incomprehensibility is a sign of its failures or its shortages. And so this idea of both, because it's not only that certain subjects are shown over like a longer span than they would in like a one single photograph, but it's that even in the ways that they're shown in those years, only really shows us like partial aspects of them as people. And so there's a lot of ways in which partiality shows up in both the ways that the images are constructed, but also in the ways that they're displayed in this particular exhibition. And so I am like this, whenever I leave thinking about Luther's work, I just keep thinking about it over and over because it's so dense and it's so rich and there's so much to think about. But this idea of partial access, or even sometimes no access, or as a way to sort of like flip the ways in which like the white supremacist worldview, talking in these like deterministic, fixed, categorizable, this is what you are ways of approaching your own sort of like personal subjectivity, but then doing it in a way that is supposed to be objective, scientific, and using all of these sort of like detachments to kind of like impose these subjective opinions as objective reality. And so the ways in which Luther is able to use the ways in which he kind of like frames his photographs or adds in the object that he uses to make the photographs, the camera, it is like almost like in the Wizard of Oz, where you have you see behind, it's the wizard pulling all those levers. It's like it shows its own construction in its making, and then it is a consciously constructed image, and it consciously leans into its construction as a way to understand how all of these sort of like ways in which we are generating information are subjective, even in institutional settings, that this objectivity is a fallacy. And like what Chris Carl says, it's like everything is a thinly veiled story of the eye. And so the eye is hyper present here, and it's going in the opposite stream of like making its imageness very present.
And there's a tension too, and I think what I picked up on from what you were just saying that just occurred to me now, which is that there is this, resistance to letting the viewer see everything, but then at the same time putting literally everything that has informed the work literally on the table, the physical table, to say these are the network of references that the artist is drawing inspiration from, and that also his collaborator subjects are involved in. So there are also images of cameras that are taken either by other cameras or in a mirror, that are often obstructing faces. So the very means of production are like very clearly shown in the work. And then all of these, like notes to oneself, underlined passages from essays or reviews. There are many physical books that it was so hard to resist wanting to open to know what is being bookmarked in every page, because there's a pen marking a spot in one page. You can see here that there's, a couple Post-its in Tina Camp's book. Yeah. So wanting, to even know more as a viewer, I felt like everything was there, and yet I still wanted more.
And how, because these are the things that we're supposed to, in presenting ourselves as these sort of like geniuses that came out of nowhere and just invented everything, that we're supposed to erase and wipe out and smooth away after the final result has been made. And so it's really very smart to come and approach it this way and like actually show all of this is me, my working.
Yeah, I think I want to like respond to what you said about this kind of like deconstructions, of the making. But I think I would say the artistic value of his work is that even though he deconstructed, there is still some some resistance to full access, right? Like for example, like you see this book right here, like you wanting to open it, it's so tempting to like open to where it's where the bookmark is, but you can't touch, right? There's a label that please do not touch. But I think so in a way it's kind of like this like the way that I usually describe it is like a storefront, where where it's like a means of distraction, where you set up kind of like a storefront where you show everything, but at the same time, it's a way for you to distract the gaze elsewhere, and the gap that's kind of like that's placed in the shadow. That is where community building happens. Because that's where like people who feel overexposed or like feel marginalized, often like tokenized, would go there, would retreat there, and then kind of like start to heal and to build their own communities. And it's evident in, if we recall the first image of the slide, right? It's kind of like those look like documentary photo from a community workshop, but you don't fully see what's going on. You just have like a tiny peek of it. So to me, that is kind of like the artistic value in the deconstruction as a way, kind of like what's that, kind of like a redirection, deconstruction,
Yeah,
of
because
making.
it's making me think of this sort of way of thinking about access as, or like the ways in which he uses sort of like partiality and opacity as a way to sort of resist and push back against not only full access, but the expectation of full access. And especially when you're sort of having to navigate the world in certain kinds of bodies, there is, even in photography especially, when it comes to the Black body, that there is not only a presumption of access, but a invasive presumption of access, and an access of, the full access to the Black body in the ways that in sort of scientific photography and, anthropological photography and colonial archive photography and, the topless shots of the Black, body, or shots of like lacerated backs of Black bodies, and this sort of like opening up that is supposed to be, ongoing and sort of just a right that any white gaze that wants to go in and penetrate the Black body in that way has the right to do it indefinitely and indiscriminately. And so this way of thinking about opacity and partiality as a refusal of that indiscriminate access and that indiscriminate, invasive and evasive gaze too, I think is something that I think about a lot.
Yeah, and I want to turn it over to folks in the audience in case there's conversation or discussion next. But the last point I had that we all talked about in our kind of pre-conversation was also about the function of the studio in Konadu's practice, which is so clearly the subject and site of all of the work. So, compared to a photographer who might try and erase the fact that the work is made in studio or try and make a space in the photograph that betrays the fact that it's made in a studio space. Konadu treats the studio as he describes it, like a community center, a place where people and friendships are made, where dissent and arguments happen, and as a really central to the work. And that's something that comes through quite obviously in the exhibition. But it's interesting to think about the space of the photographer's studio as not a solitary space, but as a community space and a space of collaboration. Should we open it up to any questions, comments,
yeah.
thoughts?
There's some
from
responses
folks in
from the audience. Tom.
Thanks. Just really enjoyed this conversation. Thinking about Luther's withholding, as you mentioned, but I think he's also giving access to the framing or also the interior architecture. And you talked about the architecture of the show, and so there's that authority, but he's making that subjective as well. And I was just wondering if you could talk about the architectural aspect of his I guess deconstruction of the walls, and so we're seeing that sort of that scaffolding that isn't objective either, but it gives the illusion of objectivity. So I think what he's trying to do is make the architecture subjective. But it's just because you were saying he hasn't approached architecture so much in his work, so I'm curious to hear more about this change.
Yeah. I think, sorry.
Great question.
Yeah, no, it is a great question, and I don't think that I can fully answer. I think, that's a better question for Luther. But just from, if I, could offer an answers, just from my experience, kind of like putting this show together, I think it's pretty much about challenging a singular point of view that often in curatorial practice that we often, try to enforce for the sake of accessibility, right? Kind of like everything middle point 54 from the ground up, make sure that, wherever you stand in the gallery, you will be able to like spot all the work, right? Whereas in here, you will see that a lot of work were hung definitely not at 54, right? There's the top, like higher, lower, and the walls that we build in the way were conceived at the framing devices as well, right? You can see through it into a room, but then if you try to stand at a different vantage point or like different spot in the gallery, you have a different vantage point to the rest of the show. So I was actually very impressed with the documentation that we received from Carrie Shaw, because when I was trying to take photos of the show myself, it was so challenging because you just can't take enough photo to really convey, like what the exhibition looks like and feels like, right? It has to be like a collage of like multiple views stitched together, and not only from different angles, but also from different heights because of the variety. So yeah, so to me that is kind of like a resistance to kind of like one singular objective point of view from the exhibition designer, right? But now I think depend on your own subjectivity, your own physicality, you will have the different access to the experience.
Yeah.
Other questions? Yeah, Tak and I can share a mic. I will say that I hadn't thought about the gallery space being literally deconstructed, but of course it is, that you see the structure underneath the drywall is laid bare in one part of the installation.
Because I was going to say, because, I feel like you kind of answered it for us a little bit.
Oh, Thomas.
And like you said it perfectly, because I think that if it's, sort of like, it's a way for the sort of like the exhibition space itself to reflect what's happening within the photographs and what's happening, whether they are like sort of like the two-dimensional versions or the three-dimensional. It's like three different ways of being able to engage with this idea of what your sort of like ways of looking, your line of sight, and the things that you can see are literally directly related to your positionality, like where your position conditions what you can and cannot see. And so in the exhibition space itself is another sort of like iteration of that hyper-awareness of your own sort of the locale from which you're doing that sort of active looking. And not only that, but it's also mimicking the ways in which he sort of breaks and disrupts the neatly ordering of our sort of like total one total image. And so even with the ways in which the lines of sight are at once revealing but also simultaneously concealing. And so the architectural space then becomes this other way to consider framing as and also it's similarly exposed constructedness. So.
Any other questions, comments, thoughts?
John.
Nura, I was thinking about when you were talking about the confronting illegibility as failure, and I was wondering about that, how to upset that or upend that, especially when working with community with subjects who don't necessarily come from the art world too, and where if there's illegibility within within an arts audience or a frustrated legibility there about like how you maybe if those strategies that make the works if there's an accessibility in there that help with that, like from a formal perspective and through beauty and your reference to the remix there, and I'm thinking of that more emotional or aesthetic experience. If you think that's helps or fills that gap there.
Well, I think that there's so many different strategies that artists are using currently to kind of do that same work of being in the driver's seat of how much access that they are granting a public. And whether it's a artist who works primarily in a language other than English and refusing to translate, or whether it's in the case of Luther's and we have this sort of like partial access to the Black image. I think that there's various strategies, but I mean, it's in one sense, it's both very easy to do and incredibly difficult to do. So it's easy to do because you can just say no. Like if somebody asks for access or makes these unreasonable, I think unreasonable, demands for access or legibility, just because somebody asks doesn't mean you have to give. So you can have that right of refusal, but it's also undeniable that there are costs that come with that refusal to engage with an audience in that kind of way. And it's hard being on the front end of that kind of resistance, because the first people get all of the brunt of it all, but it's for everybody who comes after. So yeah, it's very difficult because the art world really is it's its own beast. And so, but I also think that it's a new type of world building. So once it feels like it can be a very lonely experience to go and push back against all this, but then it also opens you up to all this other range of people who also think like you, who also want those same things. So it can be wonderful too. I don't know if that answered your question.
We were talking though in the exhibition space too, but Tak was saying that the lack of labels and didactics in the show is also really destabilizing for a lot of visitors, which I found really interesting. It makes sense to me but then I also think the show has its own labels built into it, right? Like you've got so much to work with texturally and relationally between the images, but there is something about that illegibility that then complicates ideas about access and who can make sense of the show, who feels called into the community that's being made through the installation.
I think there's honestly a real sort of spirit of generosity, I think, with which Luther meets an audience, because part of the hesitancy is kind of to the detriment of audiences, is the expectation that they cannot handle difficulty or complexity or things that take a little bit of time to untangle. And so to me, this kind of work is actually sort of deeply respectful of an audience's ability to come and meet him where he's at, as opposed to feeling the need to dumb down or reduce or simplify with very shady attitudes toward audiences, I think.
We've got time for one final comment or question. I'm doing that classic teacher thing of counting to 10 in my head before I give up. Sometimes it takes a while to figure out what your question is. Well, if there are no further questions, we're happy, I'm sure, to stick around and chat with folks afterwards. Thank you all so much for being here. The exhibition is upstairs and open to everyone to go see if you haven't had a chance to see it yet. Thank you to everyone at the Mackenzie for making this conversation possible, and to Tak and Nura for being a part of it with me. And thank you all. Have a great rest of your afternoon.